New York City. Midnight lights flicker over the East River as sirens wail in the distance. A world away, somewhere in Mexico, a cartel lieutenant counts his cash. In Eastern Europe, a cybercriminal pushes a button and drains a fortune from a bank account he'll never see. Different faces, different crimes. But behind every system of organized chaos, from the streets to the digital underworld, one man's ghost still whispers the rules. Charles Lucky Luciano. The man who built the framework of modern organized crime. Before him, crime was violent, primitive, and personal. After him, it became a business, efficient, structured, and disturbingly rational. The rules he set nearly a century ago still define how the criminal world functions today. Rules about loyalty, hierarchy, silence. Rules about power, profit, and survival. Rules that have outlived their author, surviving long after his body was buried under a false name in Naples. Luciano didn't just run the mafia. He redesigned it. And in doing so, he created a system that mirrors the very structure of legitimate society, corporations, governments, even intelligence agencies. His genius wasn't in crime itself. It was in organization. This story isn't about the gunfights or the cigars or the smoky backrooms. It's about the psychology of control. How one man, born poor and underestimated, imposed order on chaos. How he convinced killers to follow protocols. How he built a machine so disciplined that it still runs without him. In today's cartels, you can still trace the outlines of his blueprint. Decentralized leadership, a governing body for disputes, profit sharing across territories. These are Luciano's fingerprints, ghost codes written into the DNA of organized crime. The camera drifts through sepia-toned streets of 1930s Manhattan. Speakeasies, brothels, gambling dens. Money flows through every crack in the city. Prohibition has made criminals into kings. Politicians, judges, and cops are all on the take. And yet, beneath the surface there's chaos, gangs fighting over every corner, families killing each other in the name of pride. Out of this storm emerges a man who sees beyond the blood. Luciano watches it all and begins to ask the forbidden question. What if crime could be managed like a corporation? What if the mafia could be a government unto itself? It's a question that would change the American underworld forever. But it's also one that echoes far beyond his lifetime. Because what Luciano created wasn't just a criminal structure. It was a philosophy. A belief that order, even among thieves, can outlast morality. The mafia's golden age didn't just shape the streets, it shaped how we understand power itself. The idea that if the rules are clear, the machine can survive any storm. That's why, nearly a century later, when drug lords in Colombia hold board meetings or hackers in Russia operate in cells, they're still following the unspoken logic of Luciano's law. The story you're about to hear is part history, part psychology, part prophecy. It's about ambition that turned into empire, loyalty that turned into silence, and a man who learned that control, not violence, is the ultimate weapon. It's about how Lucky Luciano, a poor immigrant kid from Sicily, became the architect of the modern mafia and, in a sense, the architect of every system built on power and fear. And as we look back, one question lingers. Were Luciano's rules born of necessity, or were they the blueprint for something much darker, a mirror reflecting the cold mechanics of modern civilization itself? Before Luciano's rise, the American underworld was a battlefield without a map. The early 1900s were an age of lawlessness disguised as opportunity, a time when immigrants crowded into tenements, industry boomed, and corruption filled the cracks of a rapidly growing nation. Crime existed but not as an organized system. It was fragmented, tribal, and blood-soaked. Each ethnic group, Irish, Italian, Jewish, Polish, guarded its territory with knives and revolvers. There were no rules, only survival. A man's word meant little. Power changed hands through bullets and betrayal. In those days, the mafia in America wasn't yet the sleek, corporate beast it would become. It was a collection of mustache Petes, old-world Sicilian bosses who brought their feudal codes across the Atlantic. They spoke of honor and family, but their loyalty ended at the tip of a stiletto. They ran neighborhoods like medieval lords, demanding tribute, enforcing silence, and clinging to an outdated vision of control rooted in Sicilian tradition. To them, power came through bloodlines and respect through fear. They distrusted innovation, despised outsiders, and refused to cooperate with anyone who wasn't Italian-born. In the melting pot of New York, this narrow worldview was a fatal flaw. Across the East River, the Irish mob controlled the docks and the politics. Jewish gangsters ran gambling rings with ruthless precision, and emerging black numbers runners in Harlem built fortunes under constant threat. Every gang fought for scraps of territory, leaving the city in a perpetual state of low-level war. It wasn't organized crime, it was organized chaos. Newspapers called it the underworld, but it was really just a patchwork of violent entrepreneurs, each convinced he was a king. The police were hardly better. Corruption oozed through every rank. Bribes determined justice. Judges turned blind eyes, detectives took payments for silence. Politicians found ways to use the criminal world as their shadow army. Every corner had a price and every crime had an owner. The Tammany Hall machine controlled elections through intimidation and favors, using mobsters as enforcers and vote-getters. The line between criminal and politician blurred until it nearly disappeared. Then came Prohibition, the spark that turned street thugs into millionaires. When the Volstead Act made alcohol illegal in 1920, the demand didn't vanish, it multiplied. Smugglers, bootleggers and speakeasy owners created a black market worth billions. But wealth brought visibility and visibility brought blood. Rival gangs blew each other apart in turf wars that left the streets littered with corpses. The newspapers loved it, the public was horrified and fascinated all at once. Figures like Al Capone became folk devils and folk heroes simultaneously. The message was clear, crime paid but it was unstable. By the mid-1920s the mafia was eating itself alive. Sicilian-born bosses clung to archaic traditions, while younger American-born gangsters, the Young Turks, saw a future where money, not nationality, defined loyalty. They wanted efficiency, partnerships, and business over blood feuds. Among them were ambitious minds like Meyer Lansky, Bugsy Siegel, Frank Costello, and Charles Lucky Luciano, men who looked at the chaos and saw opportunity. Luciano, still a rising figure at the time, watched the dysfunction with cold fascination. The old guard treated crime like a family affair. He saw it as an industry waiting for reform. The Sicilians were obsessed with vendettas, Luciano was obsessed with profit. He began to study how legitimate businesses worked. Delegation, hierarchy, shared profits, and strategic alliances. He realized that chaos was the enemy of success. If the mafia could unify, if its power could be structured like a corporation, it could control not just the streets but the economy itself. But in the 1910s and early 1920s, that dream was still impossible. The mafia had no single leader, no governing council, and no rules that applied to all. Bosses like Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano ruled through paranoia. They trusted no one, not even their own men. Loyalty was a myth. Betrayal was expected. Dozens of small wars flared up between Italian factions, costing money, lives, and influence. The mafia was powerful, yes, but fragmented. A kingdom of broken crowns. Meanwhile, America itself was changing. Cities grew faster than the government could control them. Immigrant communities carved out their own systems of justice. The American dream was reserved for the rich and native-born, so the poor created their own version, through rackets, extortion, and black markets. The streets became laboratories of power. And while most gangsters were too busy fighting to notice, one man was quietly observing the patterns beneath the bloodshed. Luciano was part of this world, but he saw it from above, as if watching a chessboard that everyone else thought was just a street brawl. He recognized that crime in America lacked what every empire needs: organization. Without it, the future of the underworld would collapse under its own greed. The chaos of the early mafia era wasn't just a backdrop to his rise, it was the problem he intended to solve. And that problem, the endless cycle of violence, ego, and disunity, would soon explode into the Castellamarese War, the bloodiest internal conflict in mafia history. A war that would clear the board for Lucky Luciano's grand experiment, transforming an ancient brotherhood of killers into a modern criminal corporation. He was born Salvatore Lucania in 1897, in Lercara Fritti, a dusty, sunburned village in Sicily surrounded by barren hills and silence. His father worked in a sulfur mine, his mother mended clothes, and their life was defined by poverty. There were no dreams in that part of Sicily, only survival. In that world, crime wasn't rebellion, it was necessity. Power belonged to the strong, silence was safety, and loyalty could save your life. The boy who would one day be called Lucky Luciano absorbed these lessons before he could even spell his own name. In 1906, the Lucania family boarded a crowded ship bound for New York City, chasing the same mirage every immigrant saw on the horizon, the American dream. They arrived with nothing but a few coins and a belief that hard work could buy respect. What they found instead was the Lower East Side, a crowded, filthy maze of tenements packed with immigrants from a dozen nations, each fighting for the same scraps. It was a world of noise and desperation. Men worked themselves to death for pennies, women took in laundry until their hands bled, and children learned to fight before they learned to read. Salvatore, now going by Charles, quickly learned that in America, survival wasn't about honesty. It was about hustle. He started small, running errands, carrying goods, then shaking down smaller kids for nickels. On the streets of New York, respect didn't come from where you were born. It came from how much fear you could command. And Charles was quick, cunning, and utterly fearless. By the time he was 10, he was already part of a local street gang, one of hundreds that ruled the alleys of Manhattan. In these backstreets he met two boys who would shape his destiny. Meyer Lansky, a sharp Jewish kid with an eye for numbers, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, a volatile but charismatic bruiser. The three formed an unlikely alliance, Italian, Jewish, and Eastern European, in a world where ethnic lines were supposed to divide. Luciano saw something in Lansky that the old Sicilian bosses would never have understood: intelligence without arrogance. Together they formed a friendship built not on culture but on ambition. As he grew older, Luciano's street smarts evolved into strategy. He ran protection rackets at school, charging other kids to keep bullies away. When he wasn't extorting lunch money, he was studying the ways of the men who ran the streets: gamblers, pimps, and bootleggers. He didn't see them as criminals, he saw them as businessmen. Each had an operation, a product, and a network. The cops were merely the cost of doing business. He started dressing better, talking smoother, and thinking bigger. His early arrest records read like the rough draft of a legend: theft, assault, illegal gambling. But what stands out isn't the crimes themselves, it's how he handled them. When questioned by police, he never talked. He understood the value of silence early on, the foundation of omerta. When beaten, he didn't beg. When betrayed, he learned. Every setback became another layer of armor. By 17, Luciano had already earned a reputation. He wasn't the biggest or the toughest, but he was the most calculating. The turning point came when he started running errands for Arnold Rothstein, the notorious gambler and racketeer known as the Brain. Rothstein was everything the old Sicilian bosses weren't: calm, educated, patient. He ran crime like a Wall Street firm, and Luciano absorbed every lesson. Rothstein taught him about margins, investment, and risk. He taught him that violence is a tool, not a strategy. To Rothstein, crime wasn't about power, it was about profit. Luciano never forgot it. Under Rothstein's mentorship, Luciano began to see the world differently. He realized that in America, everyone was hustling. Politicians, cops, bankers, all playing the same game under different names. The difference was that the rich had laws to protect them, the poor had only their wits. If the system was corrupt from the top down, Luciano figured, why not build a better system from the bottom up? In his early 20s, Luciano was already making money through bootlegging and gambling. He dressed in custom suits, smoked fine cigars, and carried himself like a man twice his age. His charisma was magnetic. People liked him even when they feared him. He knew how to talk to politicians and killers in the same breath, switching tones as easily as changing hats. He didn't need to intimidate with violence. His confidence did the work for him. But there was another side to his charm, a darkness that simmered quietly. Luciano had been kidnapped and beaten by rival gangsters who tried to scare him off his territory. They slashed his face and left him for dead. He survived, barely, and from that day on, a jagged scar ran down his cheek, marking him forever. People said he was lucky to be alive. The name stuck. But Luciano himself saw that night differently. He believed fate had chosen him, that survival meant he was meant for something greater. That brush with death hardened him. He stopped thinking like a hustler and started thinking like an architect. He began building networks instead of fighting over corners. He partnered with Lansky and Siegel, setting up supply lines for bootleg liquor, smuggling it through Canada and distributing it across New York. He didn't care about ethnicity or tradition, only efficiency. Money didn't have a nationality. It only had direction. By his mid-20s, Lucky Luciano was no longer just another gangster. He was a rising strategist in a world that didn't yet understand him. To the old guard, he was disrespectful, a young upstart with dangerous ideas. To his peers, he was the future. He saw the mafia as a machine that could be refined, streamlined, and multiplied. But to make that vision real, he'd first have to dismantle the men who stood in his way. For now, though, Luciano played the long game, charming the bosses, building alliances, and studying every weakness in the system. He understood something most men never did. Real power isn't taken with a gun. It's earned through patience, information, and control. The streets had made him ruthless. Rothstein had made him wise. Together, those lessons created a new kind of criminal, one who would soon rewrite the rules of the entire underworld. By the mid-1920s, Charles Lucky Luciano had outgrown the role of a street hustler. He was no longer the kid extorting lunch money or running errands for petty racketeers. He was a businessman in a world that didn't yet understand business. To the public, crime was chaos. To Luciano, it was a market waiting to be regulated. His sharp suits, his calm demeanor, and his ability to speak the language of both politicians and killers made him something rare, a gangster who could think long-term. But before he could build his empire, he had to play by the old rules, and then find a way to destroy them. The Prohibition era had turned New York into a gold rush for the underworld. Liquor flowed like currency, and every bottle was another dollar waiting to be made. Luciano, along with his close allies, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and Bugsy Siegel, saw the opportunity early. They weren't interested in small-time smuggling or street-level deals. They thought in systems. While others fought over barrels, Luciano built networks. He set up distribution chains that stretched from Canada to Florida, paying off cops, customs agents, and dockworkers along the way. His product wasn't alcohol, it was access. And at the top of this shadow economy sat Arnold Rothstein, the man who had once mentored Luciano and who was now the silent financier of half the city's vice. Rothstein ran crime like a corporation, and Luciano was his most promising apprentice. He watched how Rothstein handled disputes, with negotiation, not violence. How he treated his criminal associates, as partners, not soldiers. Rothstein's philosophy was simple: business first, blood later. When Rothstein was murdered in 1928, Luciano inherited more than just his connections. He inherited a blueprint for how to professionalize crime. To the older Sicilian bosses, men like Joe, the boss Masuria, this kind of thinking was dangerous. They believed in bloodlines, tradition, and dominance through fear. Masuria ruled with an iron fist, collecting tribute from every racket and demanding absolute obedience. He represented the old world, greedy, superstitious, and intolerant of change. Luciano, still operating under him, saw the cracks forming. Masuria's arrogance was costly: constant wars, unstable alliances, and no vision for the future. Luciano understood that under Masuria, the Mafia could never be anything more than a gang. To evolve, it would need something radical: structure. That idea began to take form in Luciano's mind. What if the Mafia could operate like a legitimate corporation? What if each family ran its own territory but reported to a council, a governing body that prevented infighting and encouraged profit-sharing? It was a revolutionary concept for men who still lived by vendettas and personal honor. But Luciano had seen what disorganization did: it bled money and bred death. To him, unity wasn't moral, it was financial. His first step was diplomacy. He started forming quiet partnerships across ethnic lines, an unthinkable act at the time. He worked with Jewish and Irish mobsters, creating a cooperative ecosystem that blended cultures, skills, and resources. Meyer Lansky brought accounting precision. Frank Costello brought political connections. Siegel brought muscle and vision. Together, they were the nucleus of a new underworld elite, pragmatic, modern, and ruthless. Luciano also understood the value of image. He wasn't just a criminal, he was a strategist who looked like a gentleman. He attended high society events, mingled with businessmen, and made contacts with corrupt politicians who could protect his ventures. He mastered the art of blending in, the kind of invisibility that makes real power possible. To the public, he was a mysterious figure in expensive suits. To his men, he was a boss who thought 3 moves ahead. But his ambition soon brought him face to face with the greatest obstacle of his life: the old Sicilian order. The so-called Mustache Petes ran the Mafia like a medieval fiefdom. They refused to work with non-Italians, rejected innovation, and demanded absolute deference. They saw Luciano's generation, the American-born Young Turks, as reckless traitors to tradition. But to Luciano, the Mustache Petes were fossils. He respected their heritage, but he saw that their way led only to stagnation and endless war. He didn't want to destroy the Mafia, he wanted to modernize it. In private meetings, Luciano began to speak with other ambitious young gangsters about what could come next. They discussed breaking from the old bosses, forming a new structure, one built not on nationality but on profitability. He envisioned a council of equals, a board of directors of crime, where disputes could be settled without bloodshed. It was a daring idea, but he knew it would never happen while men like Masuria and Maranzano were alive. Meanwhile, Luciano's empire grew. His bootlegging operations became more refined, his gambling ventures more profitable, and his influence over unions and nightclubs more complete. Politicians began to rely on him for campaign funding, and law enforcement often found their investigations stalled by mysterious, administrative errors. He was building power not through brute force but through integration. He didn't conquer, he infiltrated. Then came the scars, literal and metaphorical. In 1929, Luciano was kidnapped by rival gangsters, beaten, stabbed, and left for dead on a Staten Island beach. He survived barely. His face was permanently disfigured, the deep slash across his cheek giving him the hardened appearance of a man carved by fate. When he returned to the city, something in him had changed. The near-death experience had crystallized his vision. He no longer wanted to be a powerful gangster, he wanted to be the architect of the entire system. He began to play both sides, outwardly loyal to Joe Masuria while secretly building bridges with Salvatore Maranzano, the rival boss leading the Castellamarese faction. Luciano's charm allowed him to operate in both worlds, learning their strategies, measuring their weaknesses. He knew that soon the two titans would clash in a war that would tear the Mafia apart. And when they did, he would be ready to reshape the ruins into something entirely new. For now, Luciano waited, watching the storm gather, calculating every move. He was still a lieutenant, technically a servant of men older and more established than himself. But in the shadows of New York, the future already belonged to him. The kid from Sicily had become something far more dangerous than a gangster. He had become a visionary, a man who saw order in the blood, profit in the chaos, and destiny in the streets that had once tried to kill him. Soon the old world would burn. And from its ashes, Lucky Luciano would build his empire. The 1920s were roaring, but beneath the sound of jazz and clinking glasses, the streets of New York were trembling. Prohibition had made criminals rich, but it had also created something far more dangerous: instability. Alliances were fragile, egos were lethal, and ambition burned hotter than loyalty. The Mafia, once a secret brotherhood, was now tearing itself apart from within. It was into this chaos that Lucky Luciano stepped, no longer a dreamer but a strategist with a plan that would end an era and begin a new one. The stage was set for the Castellamarese War, a bloody internal conflict that would reshape organized crime forever. By 1929, tensions between two powerful Sicilian bosses, Giuseppe Joe the Boss Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano, had reached a boiling point. Both men were relics of the old world, obsessed with control and blinded by arrogance. Masuria ruled New York's mafia families like a tyrant, demanding tribute and unquestioning obedience. Maranzano, newer to the city but equally ruthless, sought to overthrow him and impose his own reign. Each believed he was destined to be Capo di tutti capi, the boss of all bosses. But both underestimated the young generation rising beneath them. Men like Luciano, who saw the war not as a tragedy but as an opportunity. Luciano had served under Masuria for years. He played the loyal soldier, respectful, obedient, and quiet, but his mind was always moving. He watched Masuria's paranoia grow with every new alliance, every rumor of betrayal. The old boss demanded fealty but offered no future. To Luciano, Masuria's world was crumbling, built on superstition and fear. He wanted something different, an empire without endless wars where money, not pride, dictated power. And to create that empire, both Masuria and Maranzano would have to die. The Castellamarese War officially began in 1930, but in truth, it had been simmering for years. Gunmen roamed the streets, ambushes struck without warning, and bodies piled up in alleyways. Over 100 men were killed in less than 2 years. Businesses burned, alliances flipped overnight, and trust vanished. The war paralyzed the underworld, draining resources and creating panic. To the public it was another gangster feud. To Luciano it was a chessboard, and he was positioning his pieces for checkmate. He began meeting secretly with representatives from both sides, positioning himself as a peacemaker while feeding information to each faction. To Masuria he was still the loyal right-hand man. To Maranzano he was a valuable ally against the tyrant. But in truth he was planning their mutual destruction. His logic was simple: as long as there was a boss of all bosses, there would be war. Eliminate both and a new order could rise, one based on cooperation and profit, not ego and bloodlines. The first to fall was Joe the Boss. On April 15, 1931, Luciano arranged a meeting with Masuria at a Coney Island restaurant. It was a setup disguised as loyalty. Luciano excused himself to the restroom, leaving his boss at the table. Within seconds, gunfire erupted. 4 of Luciano's trusted men, Albert Anastasia, Joe Adonis, Vito Genovese, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, stormed in and gunned Masuria down. When Luciano returned, the old man lay face down over his cards, a dead king holding a losing hand. It was the end of an era, and the beginning of something far more dangerous. With Masuria gone, Luciano shifted his allegiance to Maranzano, helping him consolidate power. At first, Maranzano seemed like the answer. He spoke of order, discipline, and unity. He reorganized the mafia into 5 families, the structure still used today, and declared himself the supreme leader. To many it seemed he had brought peace. But Luciano saw the truth immediately. Maranzano was just another dictator in a new suit. He talked about business but ruled through fear. He replaced one tyranny with another. Maranzano's arrogance quickly made enemies. He ordered the assassination of rival gangsters, including Luciano's close ally Frank Costello. He began labeling men as untrustworthy if they weren't fully Sicilian, and he hired tax specialists to examine his soldiers' income, a move that felt less like leadership and more like paranoia. Luciano realized that Maranzano's reign would be even more dangerous than Masuria's. Worse, Maranzano had begun plotting his elimination, calling Luciano too ambitious and too American. Luciano made his decision. Just as he had removed Masuria, he would now remove Maranzano. But this time he would do it cleaner, smarter, and faster. He reached out to his Jewish allies, Meyer Lansky and Bugsy Siegel, and set the plan in motion. On September 10, 1931, Luciano arranged a meeting with Maranzano at his office in the New York Central Building. But instead of Luciano, a team of assassins disguised as government agents entered the room. They announced an inspection, then drew their guns and stabbed Maranzano to death. The self-proclaimed boss of all bosses was gone. The murders of Masuria and Maranzano ended decades of mafia blood feuds. For the first time there was no supreme ruler, no single man claiming divine authority. The old Sicilian hierarchy was dead, and from its ashes, Lucky Luciano would build something unprecedented, a democracy of crime. The Castellammarese War had cost hundreds of lives, but to Luciano, it was necessary bloodshed, the painful birth of order. In the aftermath, he called a secret meeting of America's top mafia figures. The tone was revolutionary. No more boss of all bosses. No more senseless wars. From that day forward, every family would be autonomous but united under a single cooperative body, the Commission. It would act like a board of directors, settling disputes, dividing territories, and ensuring that business came before blood. Every major decision would require consensus. Violence would become a last resort. The mafia, once governed by chaos, now had a constitution. To outsiders it was still organized crime. But to those inside it was something else entirely, an institution. The mafia had become a shadow government, one that operated by rules, discipline, and structure. Luciano's brilliance lay not in brutality but in governance. He understood that even among criminals, stability was the ultimate form of control. The Castellammarese War wasn't just a turning point in Luciano's life, it was the crucible that forged modern organized crime. It taught him that violence could win power but only organization could keep it. The chaos that had defined his youth was over. The age of Lucky Luciano, and his new order of rational, structured criminal empire, had begun. When the gun smoke of the Castellammarese War finally cleared in 1931, the American mafia stood at a crossroads. For decades it had been a disorganized, blood-soaked relic of old-world feudalism, but now, for the first time, there was a vacuum. 2 kings had fallen, and every gangster in New York held his breath, waiting to see who would claim the throne. But Lucky Luciano had no intention of wearing a crown. He didn't want to be the boss of all bosses, he wanted to make sure no one ever could be again. That was the genius of his next move, the Commission. A new kind of government for the criminal world, part parliament, part corporation, and entirely his creation. Luciano understood that empires built on personality don't last. They crumble the moment the leader falls. What the mafia needed was something self-sustaining, a structure that would outlive its creators. In his mind, the solution was simple: decentralize power. Give every family control over its own territory but tie them all to a shared council that made rules, settled disputes, and divided profits. That way, no single man could start another civil war, and the machine would keep running smoothly. He would replace dictatorship with democracy, or at least the criminal version of it. In late 1931, Luciano summoned the heads of the most powerful mafia families across the country to a series of secret meetings. They gathered in hotel suites, cigar smoke hanging heavy in the air, surrounded by bodyguards who didn't speak a word of English. At these clandestine conferences, Luciano laid out his vision. He spoke calmly, almost academically, using the language of business. The commission, he explained, would be like a board of directors overseeing all organized crime in America. Each family would have autonomy within its own territory, New York, Chicago, Detroit, Buffalo, Cleveland, and beyond, but all major decisions would require group approval. Disputes would be brought before the council, and majority rule would decide the outcome. At first, many old-timers resisted. The idea of sitting at a table with rivals, some of them non-Sicilian, felt like sacrilege. But Luciano's charisma was irresistible. He wasn't demanding submission, he was offering opportunity. This way, he told them, we all make money. No more wars, no more blood on the streets. You want to be rich? Then stop killing the customers. In the cold logic of profit they found common ground. Slowly the dissent faded and the new order took shape. The commission was composed of the heads of the most powerful mafia families, beginning with the 5 families of New York. Luciano's own, led by him directly, the Prophesai family, the Mangano family, the Gagliano family, and the Bonanno family. Joining them were national representatives, Al Capone's Chicago outfit, the Buffalo crime family, and others who operated in major American cities. Each would send emissaries to the table, and together they would decide everything from territory lines to assassination authorizations. For the first time, the mafia had something resembling a constitution. This system transformed organized crime into something far more dangerous than a street gang. It became a bureaucracy. There were rules, protocols, and checks and balances. Violence, once impulsive and emotional, became a calculated business decision. If a soldier wanted to kill someone, he needed permission. If 2 families had a conflict, they brought it before the commission like lawyers before a court. The chaos of the old mafia was gone. In its place stood an invisible government. Luciano's role within this new world was subtle but absolute. Though officially all bosses were equal, everyone knew who had built the system. His influence ran through every conversation, every alliance, every handshake. He wasn't the ruler, he was the architect. His genius lay in creating a system so balanced that it made him indispensable. He didn't need to declare power, the structure itself reflected his will. The commission's reach extended far beyond the Italian-American underworld. Luciano established connections with Jewish mobsters like Meyer Lansky and Dutch Schultz, Irish gangs in Boston, and even legitimate business interests that provided fronts for laundering illicit profits. In many ways, the commission resembled a multinational corporation, diversified, flexible, and capable of adapting to changing markets. When Prohibition ended in 1933, most gangsters panicked, believing their main source of income had dried up. But Luciano's system had already pivoted to other ventures: gambling, narcotics, labor racketeering, and the control of unions. The mafia had evolved from a bootlegging operation into a diversified criminal empire. Perhaps Luciano's most innovative move was the creation of what insiders called the National Syndicate. This wasn't just Italian, it was an alliance of criminal entrepreneurs across ethnic lines, managed under the same principles of efficiency and profit sharing. Luciano understood that prejudice was bad for business. The old world's obsession with bloodlines had kept the mafia small. He intended to make it global. With Lansky managing finances and Costello influencing politicians, the commission's power expanded far beyond the streets. They controlled ports, construction companies, labor unions, and even parts of the entertainment industry. Every legitimate enterprise had a shadow twin in Luciano's network. Yet for all its sophistication, the commission's foundation rested on something very primal: fear. Rules only mattered because Luciano could enforce them. Those who violated agreements, betrayed families, or broke omerta faced swift and merciless punishment. But even this violence was strategic, almost ritualistic. Assassinations were approved by vote and executed with precision. There were no random killings, no messy displays of brutality. Order was everything. In this way, Luciano managed to transform the act of murder into a form of governance. The brilliance of the commission was not only in its structure but in its psychology. Luciano understood human nature: the need for power, the fear of losing it, and the greed that binds men together more tightly than loyalty ever could. He knew that as long as everyone got a share, they would protect the system that fed them. That was his unspoken law: make everyone rich and they'll defend you forever. This was the moment when organized crime stopped being a street business and became an institution. The mafia now had stability, hierarchy, and governance, all modeled on the same systems that ruled corporate America. It was no longer an outsider's rebellion, it was a shadow version of the American dream itself. Luciano had done what no one before him dared: he made crime predictable. But the true genius of his system was how invisible it made him. With power distributed across families and decisions made collectively, Luciano could no longer be singled out as the boss. He was just one voice among many, at least on paper. In reality, he was the center of gravity, the quiet force keeping the universe aligned. He had built a structure that could survive any man's downfall, even his own. And soon that foresight would prove essential. Because power, once systematized, always draws attention, not just from rivals but from the law. The commission had made the mafia efficient, wealthy, and untouchable. But it had also made it visible. The government, the press, and ambitious prosecutors were starting to look closer. And in the shadows of that scrutiny, the first cracks in Luciano's perfect system were beginning to form. For now, though, he stood triumphant. The war was over, the blood was washed away, and in its place stood a new empire, sleek, organized, and governed by the rules of the man who had no crown but commanded an entire nation of criminals. Lucky Luciano had created the commission not to rule, but to ensure that his rule would never end. For all his brilliance, Lucky Luciano understood one bitter truth: no empire, no matter how efficient, can survive without enemies. The commission had given him stability, but it had also created an environment where power was diffuse, ambition was rampant, and betrayal was a matter of timing. The system might have been designed to prevent open warfare, but underneath its surface, rivalries still simmered like hot coals under wet ash. Alliances were forged in smoke-filled rooms and broken with a single whisper. For every man who admired Luciano's vision, there was another who resented his dominance, and many who secretly plotted to test his strength. At the center of this shifting web were the allies who had helped Luciano build his empire, and the enemies who would spend years trying to dismantle it. The two forces were often indistinguishable. In the underworld, friendship and competition were two sides of the same coin, and loyalty was a currency that depreciated fast. Frank Costello was perhaps Luciano's most trusted confidant, the quiet diplomat of the organization. Unlike the volatile gangsters who thrived on violence, Costello was refined, almost aristocratic. He wore tailored suits, spoke with politicians, and understood that influence was often more powerful than bullets. Costello became the mafia's unofficial ambassador to the world of legitimate business and politics. Through him, Luciano extended his reach into city halls, labor unions, and even the highest circles of government. He bribed cops not to look, judges not to care, and senators not to ask questions. Costello was the bridge between crime and respectability, a man who could host both gangsters and governors at the same table. Then there was Meyer Lansky, the strategist, the accountant, the man who saw numbers where others saw chaos. To Lansky, the underworld was not a battlefield but a market. He had a mind for balance sheets, a gambler's sense of probability, and a mathematician's patience. He handled investments, laundered profits, and established offshore accounts in Cuba and the Caribbean, years before the concept of tax havens even entered the public consciousness. His friendship with Luciano went beyond business. They shared a belief that crime could be rationalized, modernized, and made sustainable. In many ways, Lansky was the intellectual twin of Luciano's ambition, the thinker behind the throne. Together with Bugsy Siegel, the trio became the new face of organized crime, young, modern, and dangerous. Siegel was the wild card, the enforcer with movie star charisma and a taste for excess. He was the perfect symbol of the new mafia, ruthless, glamorous, and unpredictable. Siegel's rise mirrored the intoxicating allure of the American underworld, power earned not through heritage but through will. But even among friends, ambition was a double-edged blade. Siegel's volatility, Lansky's pragmatism, and Luciano's authority would later form cracks in what once seemed like an unbreakable alliance. Their power wasn't limited to New York. Luciano's network stretched nationwide. In Chicago, Al Capone's empire had already set the standard for organized crime during Prohibition. After Capone's imprisonment, his lieutenant Frank Nitti and the Chicago outfit joined the commission, aligning their interests with Luciano's business-first philosophy. In Detroit, the Purple Gang controlled bootlegging routes across the Great Lakes. In Cleveland, Mo Dalitz ran gambling rackets tied directly to Luciano's syndicate. For the first time, crime in America operated as a coordinated network, a shadow nation that spanned coast to coast. But unity, as always, came at a cost. Old bosses who survived the Castellamarese War, like Joe Prophesy and Vincent Mangano, never fully trusted Luciano's methods. They tolerated the commission but despised his openness to outsiders. To them, bringing in Jews and Irish partners was a betrayal of Cosa Nostra's purity. They whispered in back rooms about Luciano's arrogance, his ambition, and his willingness to corrupt sacred traditions. These tensions simmered quietly for years, waiting for the right moment to ignite. And then there was Thomas E. Dewey, the enemy who didn't come from the streets but from the marble halls of justice. Dewey, a young, relentless prosecutor, had made his name by going after corrupt politicians and high-profile racketeers. Unlike other lawmen, he didn't fear the mafia's reach. He saw Luciano as the embodiment of organized crime, the man behind every racket, every illegal dollar, every corrupt deal in New York City. To Dewey, bringing down Luciano wasn't just about law enforcement, it was about cleansing America's soul. Dewey's investigations began quietly, but his reputation grew fast. Newspapers hailed him as the racket buster, a man immune to intimidation or bribery. Luciano's name soon appeared in confidential reports, whispered among agents who knew that behind every union contract, every gambling parlor and every brothel, there was a thread that led back to him. For the first time, Luciano faced an opponent he couldn't intimidate, outspend, or eliminate. Dewey represented a new kind of enemy, one who fought with the law instead of guns, with headlines instead of bullets. Inside the commission, cracks deepened. Some bosses worried that Luciano's growing visibility made everyone a target. His success, once a symbol of the mafia's strength, now threatened to draw too much attention. Even his allies began to wonder whether his influence had become too vast. Frank Costello urged him to step back, to keep a lower profile. Lansky advised moving operations offshore. But Luciano, confident, perhaps overconfident, believed his system was bulletproof. He had bribed the police for years, owned judges, and had politicians on his payroll. He couldn't imagine that the same system that had built his empire might now be used to destroy it. While the government closed in, trouble brewed inside the organization itself. Siegel's reckless behavior in Los Angeles, his high-profile lifestyle, and his ties to Hollywood starlets made headlines that no gangster wanted. Meanwhile, smaller families resented the dominance of Luciano's group. They saw the commission not as democracy but as dictatorship in disguise. Paranoia began to spread. Old loyalties faltered. And in an empire built on alliances, the smallest betrayal could bring everything crashing down. Still, Luciano remained outwardly calm. He threw lavish parties, dressed impeccably, and conducted meetings with the composure of a CEO. But beneath the charm was a man who sensed the tightening noose. He had built his empire on the illusion of control, but control is only as strong as the silence it commands. And now people were talking. As Dewey's investigation intensified, rumors of betrayal started circulating through the underworld. Informants whispered that someone close to Luciano was feeding information to the authorities. Some said it was a rival boss, others believed it came from within his own circle. Luciano dismissed the rumors, he had survived worse. But history was already turning against him. The alliances that once made him invincible were about to become his greatest weakness. The age of alliances was over. What followed would be the age of exposure. The law, the press, and Luciano's own lieutenants were aligning against him in ways no bullet could prevent. The machine he built, the commission, the syndicate, the empire of invisible power, had become too big to hide, too powerful to ignore, and too vulnerable to remain untouchable. Lucky Luciano had unified the underworld, but in doing so, he had made it a single target. The allies who had once built his world would soon be powerless to save it. And the enemies who had waited patiently in the shadows were finally ready to strike. By the mid-1930s, Lucky Luciano's empire was no longer just a criminal network, it was an invisible government. From gambling parlors to union halls, from brothels to boardrooms, his influence stretched through every corner of New York City. But beneath that polished surface, a hidden war was brewing, one that would not be fought with Tommy guns in the streets, but in courtrooms, newspapers, and whispers in the dark. The era of gangland shootouts was giving way to a quieter, deadlier kind of conflict. The war for control of information. Thomas E. Dewey had become the face of reform, a young prosecutor determined to dismantle the criminal empires that had grown rich during Prohibition. Unlike the corrupt politicians and police who could be bought, Dewey was incorruptible. He built his cases like a strategist, not a crusader, following money, phone records, and testimonies rather than bullets. His weapon wasn't fear but publicity. Every arrest, every raid, every confession became a headline. Dewey understood that public perception was half the battle. To destroy Luciano, he didn't just need to convict him, he needed to make America believe he was the devil behind organized crime itself. Luciano, for his part, underestimated Dewey at first. He had outmaneuvered rivals far more violent and cunning. A prosecutor, he thought, was just another politician with a price. But Dewey wasn't after money, he was after immortality. Bringing down Luciano would make his career, and Luciano's confidence blinded him to that hunger. While he continued to hold meetings, host parties, and operate as though untouchable, Dewey's men were quietly building a case that targeted the one part of his empire he ignored: prostitution. It was an unlikely weapon. Luciano had never seen the sex trade as central to his operations. It was messy, low-level, and carried moral stigma even in the underworld. But Dewey knew that vice operations left paper trails, witnesses, and victims. By arresting hundreds of prostitutes and madams across the city, he built a web of testimony that eventually pointed upward, straight to Luciano's door. Some women were threatened with long prison sentences, others bribed with freedom, until finally a few began to talk. Their stories painted Luciano as the mastermind behind a sprawling prostitution ring. Whether true or not didn't matter. The headlines did the damage. As Dewey's investigation gained traction, paranoia gripped the underworld. Informants disappeared overnight. Brothels were shut down, gambling dens raided, and even legitimate fronts came under scrutiny. Luciano's name, once spoken with fear, now appeared in newspapers alongside words like pimp and slave trader. To the public, the mighty chairman of the Board of Organized Crime was suddenly reduced to a vulgar criminal. It was psychological warfare, and it worked. Inside the commission, the tension was palpable. Some bosses urged Luciano to flee the country before he was arrested. Others distanced themselves entirely, fearing their own exposure. Luciano's carefully maintained balance of power was slipping. Even his trusted lieutenants, Costello, Lansky, and Siegel, struggled to control the chaos. They bribed witnesses, pressured cops, and burned evidence, but Dewey's case grew stronger. Every defense only seemed to confirm his guilt. The war had turned. No bullets, no street battles, just subpoenas, testimonies, and the slow grind of justice. For the first time in his life, Luciano couldn't shoot his way out. He was fighting a new kind of enemy, the system he had learned to manipulate. And yet, even as his world began to collapse, Luciano refused to show fear. He attended his trial dressed impeccably, smirking at reporters, shaking hands with guards. To the public, he was still Lucky, the man who survived every trap, every betrayal. But deep down, he must have known, the war he was fighting wasn't just for his freedom, it was for the survival of the entire underworld structure he'd built. In 1936, after years of evading justice, the hidden war came to an end. Dewey's investigation culminated in Luciano's arrest, trial, and eventual conviction. The man who had built a criminal corporation more sophisticated than most legitimate businesses was undone not by rivals or bullets, but by the testimony of prostitutes and the ambition of one relentless prosecutor. The hidden war had revealed an uncomfortable truth. Power built on fear could control men but not society. Luciano's empire had thrived in darkness, but now the light had found it. The age of secrecy was over, and the fall had begun. When the news of Lucky Luciano's arrest broke in 1936, it hit the underworld like an earthquake. The unbreakable man, the architect of modern organized crime, was finally in chains. For more than a decade, he had walked through blood, betrayal, and power struggles untouched. Now his empire trembled. Reporters swarmed the courthouse. Headlines screamed, "Luciano Vice King faces justice." The city that had once bowed to his invisible rule now watched eagerly as the mighty were dragged down. Thomas E. Dewey's case was built not on physical evidence but on psychology, the same tool Luciano had used to dominate his enemies. Dewey understood that perception was power. He painted Luciano not just as a criminal but as a symbol of moral decay, a man who had corrupted the very fabric of America's cities. Every witness, every photograph, every headline chipped away at the myth of the untouchable Don. Dewey's narrative was simple. Lucky Luciano wasn't a businessman, he was the boss of vice, profiting from the exploitation of women, the manipulation of politics, and the decay of society. In truth, the case against Luciano was tenuous. Dewey's star witnesses were prostitutes and brothel operators, many of whom had been coerced, intimidated, or bribed into testifying. Their stories often contradicted one another, and none could directly connect Luciano to the management of prostitution rings. But Dewey didn't need hard proof, he needed a conviction. The public's hunger for justice, for spectacle, was stronger than logic. The courtroom became a theater, and Luciano was cast as its villain. Inside that courtroom, Luciano sat still, composed, almost regal. He wore finely tailored suits, kept his voice calm, and refused to show emotion. His silence was strategic. If he couldn't win through law, he would win through presence. Every glance, every faint smile seemed to mock his accusers. To his followers, he was still Lucky, the man who couldn't be broken. To the jury, that same confidence looked like arrogance. Dewey played on it masterfully, painting Luciano's composure as proof of guilt, the cold calm of a man who believed he was above the law. Meanwhile, his organization scrambled to survive. Frank Costello worked frantically to protect their political connections. Meyer Lansky tried to keep business running smoothly, laundering money and hiding assets. The commission met in secret, debating whether to cut Luciano loose for the good of everyone else. For all its structure, the empire Luciano built was suddenly headless. No one wanted to take his place and no one dared to defend him publicly. The same bosses who had once toasted to his brilliance now whispered that maybe Dewey was right. Maybe Luciano had become too powerful, too visible, too dangerous. As the trial dragged on, Luciano began to sense the inevitable. The law wasn't just after him, it was after the idea of him. Dewey wasn't prosecuting a man, he was prosecuting a myth. And myths are impossible to defend in court. On June 18, 1936, the verdict came down, guilty on 62 counts of compulsory prostitution. The judge sentenced Luciano to 30 to 50 years in prison, the harshest punishment ever handed to an organized crime figure in American history. Reporters described the moment as the death of the underworld's invisible king. For Luciano, it wasn't just the loss of freedom, it was the collapse of his identity. The man who had built an empire on power, control, and influence now found himself caged like any street thug he once commanded. As he was led from the courtroom, cameras flashed, and the press captured an image that would haunt him forever. Luciano, head high, cigarette in hand, walking into his own downfall. In the days that followed, his empire began to fragment. Without his guiding presence, rival bosses tested boundaries. Smaller families vied for independence. Some refused to pay their dues to the syndicate. Others formed secret alliances behind closed doors. The commission, once a unified council, devolved into a patchwork of factions. Luciano's great innovation, decentralization, now worked against him. The very system designed to keep the mafia stable without a single leader ensured that no one could restore it when he was gone. Yet even in defeat, Luciano remained calculating. From his cell he refused to panic. He communicated through lawyers, coded letters, and visiting family members. Slowly he began to reassert control. If the streets couldn't be ruled through presence, they would be ruled through influence. The message was clear: prison walls could not contain the reach of Lucky Luciano. Still, something fundamental had shifted. His arrest marked the end of the mafia's golden illusion of invincibility. The newspapers had shown the world that gangsters could be tried, humiliated, and imprisoned like anyone else. The government had tasted victory, and it wanted more. The once silent war between organized crime and law enforcement had turned into open warfare. Luciano's fall sent ripples far beyond the underworld. It emboldened prosecutors, terrified politicians, and redefined how America saw organized crime. For decades, the mafia had thrived in the shadows, hidden behind fear and silence. But now it had a face, a name, a mugshot. Lucky Luciano had built the modern mafia, and by bringing him down, the law had inadvertently exposed it to the world. He had built an empire so powerful it changed the nature of crime itself. But as he sat behind bars, one thought haunted him. He had also made it visible. And in the game of power, visibility is the first step toward destruction. The trial of Lucky Luciano was more than a legal proceeding, it was theater on a grand scale, a morality play for a restless nation looking for a villain. In 1936, America was clawing its way out of the Great Depression, hungry for stories of justice, redemption, and downfall. Dewey's prosecution offered all three. From the moment the case opened, the courtroom became a stage, and every gesture, every word, every headline fed into the mythology of the Vice King of New York. The prosecution painted Luciano as a spider at the center of a vast criminal web. Witnesses were paraded before the jury, women who spoke of threats, payments, and names whispered in the night. Dewey's team presented charts, ledgers, and photographs that, while circumstantial, wove a compelling story. In the gallery, reporters scribbled every line, feeding an insatiable public appetite for scandal. Newspapers ran lurid illustrations of brothels and bootleggers. Radio shows dramatized courtroom exchanges. The audience didn't see evidence, they saw narrative. Dewey knew it. He didn't just argue facts, he told a story of corruption and redemption, one where he was the righteous hero and Luciano the seductive villain. Luciano's defense was less cohesive. His attorney, Moses Polikoff, was a capable lawyer but outmatched by Dewey's charisma and the emotional charge of the trial. The defense argued that the testimonies were unreliable, coerced, and inconsistent. And they were right. But the facts didn't matter as much as the feeling. The jury wanted to believe in justice. After years of reading about crime bosses untouchable by the law, they saw a chance to make an example. Dewey had carefully built that illusion, that convicting Luciano would mean striking a blow against the entire underworld. In those long weeks of testimony, Luciano sat like a statue. He showed no fear, no anger. He smoked, adjusted his cuffs, and sometimes smiled faintly at Dewey, a move that infuriated the prosecutor and fascinated the press. To the jury, that calm read as arrogance. To his followers, it was defiance. But inside, Luciano was calculating. He knew he couldn't win in court, but he could win in legacy. If he appeared unbroken, even in defeat, his legend would endure. Power, after all, isn't just about control, it's about perception. Then came the cross-examinations, a brutal parade of contradiction and accusation. Dewey's witnesses, prostitutes, pimps, and madams, were grilled relentlessly. Some cried, others lashed out. A few admitted that detectives had pressured them into naming Luciano. One even claimed she had never met him at all. But Dewey was a master at performance. He rephrased, reframed, and redirected, turning inconsistencies into proof of fear. The more chaotic the witnesses seemed, the more monstrous Luciano appeared. Dewey convinced the jury that only a man of extraordinary power could make people this terrified. Outside the courtroom, the media frenzy reached fever pitch. Every tabloid splashed Luciano's name across its front page. He became both a villain and a fascination, a man who embodied everything Americans secretly envied and condemned. Wealth without work, power without conscience, control without accountability. The idea of a criminal empire run like a corporation fascinated the public almost as much as it horrified them. But the spectacle came at a price. Inside the underworld, Dewey's crusade created panic. Raids spread across New York and New Jersey. Bookmakers, racketeers, and union bosses went underground. For the first time in years, the syndicate was forced to pause operations. And while Luciano's trial dominated headlines, smaller players used the distraction to shift alliances and seize territory. The machine he built was eating itself while he stood helpless in court. As the trial neared its end, Dewey delivered his final argument, a performance so fiery that reporters described it as a sermon of law. He pointed at Luciano, his voice rising with righteous fury, and declared that this man had turned vice into industry, crime into commerce, and the city into his domain. The courtroom fell silent. Even those who doubted the evidence felt the gravity of Dewey's conviction. In that moment, it no longer mattered whether Luciano had managed brothels or not. What mattered was the symbol he represented: organized crime made modern, rational, and profitable. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, the air in the courtroom was electric. Dewey didn't smile, he didn't need to. He had won not just a case but a legacy. Luciano, expressionless, merely adjusted his tie as the judge announced a sentence of 30 to 50 years in Clinton Correctional Facility. The reporters rushed out to call their editors. Within an hour, newspapers across the country carried the headline, "Lucky Falls." Yet beneath the victory there was unease. Many in law enforcement quietly questioned the fairness of the conviction. Others feared the precedent it set, that the state could win without solid proof so long as it controlled the story. But the public didn't care. For them, justice had been served. The myth of the untouchable gangster was dead. Luciano's walk from the courthouse that day was iconic. Photographers captured him handcuffed, flanked by officers, his face composed but his eyes distant. It was the image of a man who had outsmarted bullets, wars, and betrayals, but not the world's hunger for spectacle. For years, he had manipulated perception to build his empire. Now, perception had destroyed him. As the prison gates closed behind him, Luciano faced a new kind of battlefield. For the first time he was powerless, or so it seemed. But those who knew him best understood that prison would not be his tomb. It would be his laboratory. Because even in confinement, Lucky Luciano would find a way to turn defeat into strategy. The trial and sentence marked a turning point in American crime. The old mafia, ruled by personalities and vendettas, was gone. What rose in its place was something colder, more calculating, an organization that learned from Luciano's mistakes. And as the nation celebrated Dewey's triumph, few realized that the man behind bars was already planning his next move. In prison, Lucky Luciano was supposed to fade into obscurity, a fallen king stripped of his empire. The newspapers said his reign was over, that the great architect of the American Mafia had finally been dismantled. But those who truly understood Luciano knew better. Power was never about where you stood, it was about what you could control. And even behind bars, Luciano would prove that influence could stretch beyond walls, guards, and iron bars. He was sent to Clinton Correctional Facility, a cold, gray fortress in upstate New York, surrounded by razor wire and the scent of pine and concrete. Most inmates arrived broken, but Luciano arrived observing. The same instincts that helped him survive the streets of Manhattan now guided him through the rhythms of prison life. He analyzed routines, mapped out alliances, learned which guards could be trusted and which inmates carried weight. Within weeks, he understood that prison was just another system, one he could navigate, manipulate, and bend. Luciano's demeanor remained calm and composed. He read books, wrote letters, and never complained. But behind that calmness he was building connections. Many guards respected him, some feared him. He never demanded loyalty outright. Instead, he offered favors, small tokens of gratitude, a word of protection. It started with cigarettes, then small comforts, and eventually, information. Through subtle charm and calculated generosity, he created a network inside the prison that mirrored his syndicate outside. Even from his cell, Luciano continued to receive visitors, lawyers, family members, business associates. Some were legitimate, others carried coded messages. He had learned long ago that communication was the true weapon of power. With a few trusted intermediaries, he re-established lines of contact with his old allies, Meyer Lansky, Frank Costello, and others who still ran parts of the operation. His orders were never direct. They were embedded in casual remarks or written in innocent-sounding letters. Take care of the situation could mean anything from closing a deal to silencing a threat. By 1938, it was clear that Luciano's influence had not been extinguished. Reports emerged that he was still running the rackets from behind bars. Authorities denied it publicly, but privately they knew it was true. Dewey himself, now a political star on the rise, was frustrated. The man he'd put away was supposed to be a warning, not a whisper of defiance echoing through the criminal underworld. Yet Luciano remained the center of gravity. What made Luciano truly dangerous was his patience. Unlike other mobsters, he didn't panic when stripped of freedom. He understood that time could be weaponized. Prison became a place of reflection and recalibration. In conversations with trusted guards or fellow inmates, he talked about mistakes, how greed and visibility had brought too much heat, how disorganization had made the mafia vulnerable. He imagined a new model, one where bosses remained invisible, power decentralized, communication coded and minimal. The foundations of what would later become La Commission, the Mafia Commission, matured in his mind behind those walls. Outside, the world kept changing. Prohibition was long over, and new opportunities were emerging in gambling, unions, and narcotics. Luciano's associates, especially Meyer Lansky and Frank Costello, continued to expand operations internationally, Cuba, South America, even Europe. They funneled profits through offshore banks, built legitimate fronts, and diversified investments. Luciano may have been confined, but his fingerprints were still on every dollar that moved through those channels. It was during this period that Luciano's myth evolved from man to symbol. For the new generation of mobsters rising in the late 1930s and early 1940s, he became a kind of legend. The Don who created order out of chaos, the visionary who turned a street gang into an empire. His imprisonment only enhanced his mystique. From inside the cold concrete of Clinton, he became a distant godfather, a man whose name alone could settle disputes or start wars. When rival factions argued, they often asked, "What would Charlie say?" Even though Charlie was locked away hundreds of miles from the city. As World War II began, an unexpected twist shifted Luciano's fate. In 1942, the U.S. Navy grew concerned about potential Axis sabotage on the New York docks. Italian-American dockworkers controlled much of the labor force there, and rumors spread that the Mafia had influence in keeping the ports safe, or dangerous. Naval intelligence, desperate for cooperation, turned to an unlikely source: organized crime. Through intermediaries, they reached out to Meyer Lansky, who suggested an extraordinary proposition: enlist Lucky Luciano to help secure the ports. From prison, Luciano agreed. Using his network of dockside contacts, he helped the Navy maintain order, prevent strikes, and gather intelligence on Axis sympathizers. Later reports, some exaggerated, others credible, claimed that Luciano's influence even extended to aiding the Allied invasion of Sicily in 1943 by facilitating contact with Sicilian Mafia leaders. The truth remains murky, but the perception was enough. In the eyes of the government, the man once condemned as America's criminal mastermind had now become a wartime asset. That cooperation changed everything. In 1945, after nearly a decade behind bars, Luciano's lawyer petitioned for clemency, citing his wartime assistance to the U.S. Navy. Dewey, now governor of New York, faced an impossible choice. To free Luciano was politically risky, it could make him look weak or corrupt. But the intelligence reports were persuasive, and Dewey understood the value of framing the act as pragmatic. In early 1946, Luciano's sentence was commuted on the condition that he would be deported to Italy immediately after release. When he walked out of Clinton prison, the cameras were waiting again. He was older, more subdued, but still sharp-eyed and composed. The world saw a man diminished, yet those who knew him recognized the quiet triumph in his smile. He had survived the system designed to destroy him. He had turned imprisonment into leverage, transformed punishment into opportunity, and secured his release through cunning, patience, and the power of relevance. Prison had not broken Lucky Luciano. It had refined him. Inside those cold walls, he had learned the true meaning of control, the ability to influence outcomes without ever being seen. It was a philosophy that would define the next era of organized crime, and ensure that his ghost would haunt the corridors of power long after he was gone. When Lucky Luciano set foot on Italian soil in 1946, the sun was bright but the air felt foreign. For the first time since his teenage years, he was a man without a country. America, the empire he had built and ruled, had exiled him. Italy, the land of his birth, had changed beyond recognition. War had scarred its streets and humiliated its institutions. In Naples, where he eventually settled, Luciano found a city buzzing with desperation, corruption, and opportunity, all the ingredients from which he had once built an empire. But this time he was no longer a street kid hungry for power. He was an aging don in exile, a man carrying the weight of legacy and loss. At first he was treated like royalty. In the cafés of Naples, whispers followed him. Soldiers, hustlers, and black marketeers all knew his name. To them, Lucky Luciano wasn't a criminal. He was a symbol of success, a legend who had outsmarted both the law and fate. The Allied occupation had turned Italy into a breeding ground for the underground economy. Rationing, smuggling, and rebuilding had created a shadow market that stretched from Naples to Palermo. Luciano saw opportunity in chaos. Though officially forbidden from leaving Italy, he soon reconnected with the global network he and Meyer Lansky had built years earlier. Through coded letters and discreet messengers, he began to influence the flow of money, narcotics, and power. His reach extended to Havana, where Lansky and his Cuban associates were turning the island into a new Las Vegas, a paradise for gamblers, gangsters, and politicians. Luciano couldn't be there in person, but his name opened doors. Whenever deals were made, people invoked Charlie, with reverence, as though consulting an unseen oracle. But exile had its cost. The U.S. government kept a close eye on him. Italian authorities, pressured by the Americans, constantly surveilled his movements. His mail was intercepted, his phone lines tapped. Even when he walked along the Naples harbor, there was always someone watching. A young detective pretending to smoke, a car idling too long at the corner. Luciano knew the feeling well. Paranoia had been part of his life since the Lower East Side. Yet this time it felt heavier. He wasn't running an empire anymore, he was maintaining a myth. Still, the myth gave him power. In 1947 he was invited to Havana for a conference, the now famous Havana Summit. Using political connections and forged papers, Luciano slipped into Cuba under the alias Charles Luciano, Importer. The summit brought together America's most powerful mob bosses: Lansky, Frank Costello, Vito Genovese, Santo Trafficante, and others. For the first time since his arrest, they were all in one room, waiting for their old leader to speak. Luciano stood before them, older but still commanding. His message was simple and chilling: the Mafia must evolve or die. He emphasized that their operations should move away from street violence and into international business, gambling, narcotics, and legitimate enterprises. He urged them to maintain unity through structure, to avoid the personal vendettas that had once torn the families apart. He was, in essence, giving them a roadmap for the future, a blueprint for global organized crime that would last decades. That meeting solidified Luciano's status as a living legend. Even after he was forced to return to Italy under U.S. pressure once the press discovered his presence in Havana, his influence persisted. The Commission, the governing body of the American Mafia he had created years earlier, continued to operate by his principles. His philosophy had become law: keep violence to a minimum, resolve conflicts through votes, and treat crime like business. But behind the facade of control, Luciano's personal life grew lonelier. The world he once dominated moved on without him. Lansky grew rich in Havana, Costello turned respectable in New York. Genovese schemed for total control. Luciano, meanwhile, found himself pacing the marble floors of his Neapolitan apartment, staring out at the harbor, wondering what it all meant. He spent his days writing letters, visiting old friends, and taking long walks through the narrow streets of Naples, where street vendors still shouted over the noise of trams. He was a man surrounded by life but haunted by ghosts. He had lovers but no true family, wealth but no country, fame but no peace. Some evenings he sat in his favorite cafe, sipping espresso and watching young men gamble in the alleys, reflections of himself decades ago. He often spoke to acquaintances about the rules, the code that had made the mafia survive. "It's not about fear," he once said to a journalist. "It's about order. Without order, everything dies." As the 1950s rolled into the 1960s, the world of organized crime expanded globally, narcotics networks across Europe, casinos in Cuba, and new money flowing through American unions. Much of it bore Luciano's imprint. Yet his control was now symbolic. His days of commanding armies of men were over. He was an elder statesman of crime, respected, feared, but increasingly obsolete in a world moving toward newer forms of corruption. Still, even in exile, he refused to fade quietly. In his later years, he grew unexpectedly introspective. He began keeping notes, attempting to dictate his version of history. He wanted the world to understand that he hadn't created crime, he had organized it. He saw himself not as a villain, but as a realist responding to chaos. To him, the mafia wasn't evil, it was structure, discipline, and survival in a world that had offered men like him nothing else. On January 26, 1962, Lucky Luciano met with an American film producer at the Naples airport. The man wanted to make a movie about his life. Luciano, ever conscious of image, saw this as a final chance to control his story. But as he walked toward the producer in the terminal, something inside him faltered. Witnesses said he suddenly clutched his chest, stumbled, and collapsed. Within minutes, he was dead, a heart attack at age 64. The Italian police arrived, notebooks ready, cameras flashing. The producer stood frozen, holding a briefcase filled with contracts. In a strange way, Luciano's life ended exactly as it had been lived, between myth and reality, between control and collapse. When his body was flown back to New York for burial, thousands came to pay respects. Politicians, businessmen, and old gangsters all stood together in silence. They didn't come for the man alone, but for what he represented, a world built on power, loyalty, and ruthless intelligence. Luciano's final years in exile weren't a fall from grace, they were a transformation. He had become something beyond a gangster, a symbol of structure itself, the man who turned chaos into an institution. Even in death, the system he designed lived on, adapting to new faces, new cities, new eras. His name faded, but his rules did not. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of Naples, among the echoing alleys and dim bars, old men still whispered his name, not as a criminal, but as an architect of order who outlived his empire through the system he built. Lucky Luciano's death did not end his influence, it immortalized it. In the years after 1962, as the world shifted into a new era of globalization, technology, and politics, the foundations of organized crime still carried his fingerprints. His empire had long vanished, his name whispered more than spoken, yet the architecture he designed, the structure, the code, the discipline, continued to govern the underworld across continents. The commission he created became the silent government of crime, ensuring order among chaos, and enforcing the rules that Luciano had once set in motion with iron logic and cold intelligence. In many ways, Luciano's greatest creation wasn't the mafia itself, it was the concept of organized crime as a system. Before him, the mafia had been a series of clans and feuds, run by hot-headed men chasing quick profits or personal revenge. Luciano turned it into an organization, governed by principles that could outlast any one man. His genius was in recognizing that survival depended on stability, and stability required rules. "Don't make it personal," he used to say. "Make it business." That single idea became the blueprint for every criminal syndicate that followed, from the drug cartels of South America to the Yakuza in Japan and the Bratva in Russia. Even in legitimate industries, echoes of Luciano's philosophy can be seen: hierarchy, profit-sharing, silence, and loyalty. Corporations learned what the mafia perfected: control the supply chain, eliminate middlemen, and diversify risk. Luciano's model blurred the lines between the criminal and the corporate, showing that power didn't depend on legality but on organization. In the United States, the decades following his death saw the mafia reach its golden age. The 5 families he helped organize, Genovese, Gambino, Lucchese, Colombo, and Bonanno, ruled New York like hidden monarchs. They managed construction, unions, shipping, and entertainment. They sat down to vote on assassinations, divided territories like nations, and punished betrayal with precision. Even when faces changed and generations passed, the commission ensured the machine kept running. The FBI would later call it the most efficient criminal corporation in history. But every system carries the seed of its own decay. By the 1970s and 80s, the very order Luciano built began to fracture. New leaders craved fame more than discipline. Men like John Gotti brought the mafia back into the spotlight, flashing wealth and arrogance, the opposite of Luciano's quiet control. The rule of keep your head down was broken. As visibility increased, law enforcement adapted. Wiretaps, surveillance, and undercover operations exposed the mafia's hidden structure. In courtrooms across America, prosecutors invoked Luciano's name, calling him the father of the modern mob, both in admiration and condemnation. Yet even as the old mafia began to crumble under federal indictments, Luciano's ideology found new homes. His rules crossed oceans. The Camorra in Naples, the 'Ndrangheta in Calabria, the Triads in Hong Kong, all reorganized along principles eerily similar to Luciano's. The emphasis on loyalty, structure, secrecy, and profit above emotion became a universal language of power. The drug cartels of Mexico mirrored his efficiency, building networks where lieutenants operated like corporate executives, and violence was just a tool of management. Psychologically, Luciano's legacy is even deeper. He showed that crime could be rationalized, not as madness or impulse but as business strategy. He didn't see himself as evil, only pragmatic. In a world that denied him opportunity because of his origins, he created his own system of meritocracy, brutal, yes, but logical. That mindset resonates even today in boardrooms and backrooms alike. Power belongs to those who understand the game better than anyone else. Culturally, Luciano's shadow lingers through film, literature, and media. Every cinematic gangster, from Michael Corleone in The Godfather to Tony Soprano, carries a trace of his psychology. The man torn between loyalty and ambition, morality and survival. Even modern audiences, decades removed from his lifetime, remain fascinated by his paradox. The criminal who sought order, the outlaw who believed in discipline, the villain who understood humanity too well. And perhaps that's why Lucky Luciano's rules still control organized crime today. Not because they are written down, but because they reflect something eternal in human nature. The desire for structure within chaos, for control within disorder. His principles endure because they aren't just about crime, they're about power itself. Whether in mafia families, corporations, or governments, the same logic applies. Loyalty is currency, information is leverage, and perception is control. When you strip away the myth, what remains is a simple truth. Lucky Luciano didn't just change the mafia, he changed how power works. His empire may have fallen, his name may have faded, but his system still breathes in every transaction built on silence, trust, and fear. In the end, the man who built order from lawlessness left behind a world still operating by his invisible rules. His ghost lives not in the streets of New York or the alleys of Naples, but in the quiet calculations of men who understand what he once taught. To rule, you don't need to be seen, only obeyed. The story of Lucky Luciano ends not with violence, but with silence. The kind of silence that follows a man whose shadow outlived his body. His life was a paradox. Born into poverty, he built an empire. Condemned as a criminal, he became a symbol of order. When he died in 1962, it wasn't the end of a man, it was the beginning of a myth. Luciano's genius was that he understood power better than anyone of his time. He saw that crime could be organized like business, that loyalty could be structured like law. What he built was more than the American Mafia, it was a framework for control. The Commission, his creation, became the silent parliament of crime, and its principles survived long after his death. Minimize violence, maximize profit, protect the family, and never let emotions rule decisions. Yet, his story was never just about crime. It was about the psychology of ambition, how far a man will go to never feel powerless again. Luciano rose from the slums, outwitted rivals, and turned corruption into stability. But his triumph carried a cost: isolation. He ended his life alone in exile, respected but untouchable, remembered but unreachable. Today his legacy lives not only in organized crime but in how the world understands power itself. The corporations, cartels, and political machines of the modern era all echo his logic. That order can be built from chaos if the rules are clear and control is absolute. In the end, Lucky Luciano didn't just build the mafia. He built a system that revealed how the world truly works, and how power, once organized, never really dies.